Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore. I'm Elizabeth, the events coordinator, and I am joined this evening by J.M. Hirsch, the author of Shake, Strain, Done. This book is newly out this week and is available from Gibson's Bookstore. JM will be signing copies at the store. He signed a few, but if you wanted to order some today, tomorrow, he'll be signing some more for us. J.M. Hirsch is a James Beard Award-winning food and travel writer. He is editorial director of Christopher Kimball's Milk Street, a Boston-based food media company with a 140,000 circulation print magazine, award-winning cookbooks, and public television and radio shows that reach millions of viewers and listeners. His previous cookbooks include High Flavor, Low Labor, and Beating the Lunchbox Blues. He is the former national food editor for the Associated Press and lives in New Hampshire with his son, husband, and 2 cats. JM, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell me a bit about your book.
So I'm going to start with the part that makes everybody hate me, because that's the easiest place. For my job for Christopher Kimball's Milk Street, I travel the world. When we're not in a pandemic, I do it frequently. And I travel the world to learn about food and drink. Well, one of my favorite activities as I check out new cities is to go to the best bars in that city. And I basically spend a couple of hours drinking and interrogating the bartenders because I'm just fascinated by the tips, tricks, ingredients that kind of elevate what they do and that separate, frankly, the cocktails that they make from the cocktails that you and I might make at home. And so I just find that a fascinating process, and I love learning about it as much as I can. And the problem is most of the tips, tricks, techniques, ingredients, and so forth that they use aren't necessarily applicable or approachable at home. Most of us don't have 30 gins to choose from. Most of us aren't spending a month infusing a liquor to make one cocktail. And so I get frustrated by that, and I find it's kind of difficult to translate a lot of that to home bartending. And so, which let's face it, that's where most of us do most of our drinking, especially these days. So when I set out to write a cocktail book, it was really important to me that I make these elevated cocktails, these craft quality cocktails, accessible and approachable for home bartending. And that was kind of the mission of Shake, Strain, Done, because it actually turned out to be easier than I expected and a lot more fun. But it took a little research to kind of figure out how to get those same flavors and those kind of elevated experiences that you get at a high-end bar and bring that home. But I can babble about that for quite a while and get into the nuances of it, but it's after 7 and I don't have a cocktail in my hand. So I think we should start by making a cocktail.
I think we should.
Okay.
Which one will you start us off with?
So we're going to start with the liquid crystal. And what I love about this cocktail is that it finds flavor in kind of an unexpected place. And that's one of those things that sets apart high-end mixologists, that they're kind of really unafraid of chasing flavor in unexpected places, combining them in unexpected ways. I've had cocktails in London that use miso and chestnuts and kind of crazy ingredients that you don't think of in cocktails. You think of them in cooking. And so this cocktail derives flavor from the spice cabinet, in particular fennel seeds. And what I love about it is that a lot of the kind of more obscure high-end liquors have a kind of an anisette flavor. And a lot of times bartenders will use that to kind of rinse the glass before adding the actual cocktail to it. Now, I'm not a big fan of buying obscure liquors to rinse my glass and then throw the liquor down the drain. And so I wanted to find a way to capture that same essence. And for that, I use fennel seeds. So we're going to start with a half teaspoon of whole fennel seeds, and you're going to add them directly to your cocktail shaker. And then to that, we're going to add about a 1/4 ounce of honey. Now, honey is not very common in cocktails because it doesn't necessarily mix as well as, say, a simple syrup or an agave syrup. I found that my honey, which my neighbor they don't make honey really, do they? They take care of the bees that make the honey. Anyway, and so I find it mixes pretty well. And if yours doesn't, if you're using store-bought and it doesn't mix well, you can use agave. I just like the floral notes that the honey gives this cocktail. So I'm going to use about 1/4 ounce, and I'm not going to bother measuring because why not? You know. There we go. All right. Now, to get the flavor out of those fennel seeds, you got to muddle them. And so you're going to get a muddler, and you're just going to lightly tap them. Now, when you're muddling, whether you're doing seeds or fruit or whatever, the idea is not to bash them into oblivion. It's just to break them up and release their flavor. So we're just going to break those up a little bit and get them all sticky and messy. Now, normally, if you were, say, muddling some orange sections or fruit, you would just take the muddler out. But we're dealing with so much sticky ingredients, we'd be losing so much flavor there that's stuck to the end of our muddler. So when you're doing something like this, leave the muddler in while we add the rest of our ingredients. This is a rum-based cocktail, so we're going to add 2.5 ounces of rum. And by the way, you will see over the course of this evening that I like my cocktails strong. So my cocktails generally have at least 3 ounces of liquor. I see nothing wrong with that. To that, we're going to add 1/4 ounce of ginger liqueur. I like ginger liqueur because it adds a gentle sweetness, but it also kind of adds peppery, bright notes that kind of refresh the cocktail. And we're going to add 1/4 ounce of that. That's more of a 1/2 ounce, but that's okay too. All right. Put that aside. Now that we have liquid in there, we can swish around our muddler and rinse all that flavor back into our cocktail. There we go. All right. Now we can add our ice. Now, generally you're going to shake a cocktail for 5 to 8 seconds. Because of the honey in this one, which is a little bit harder to dissolve in the cocktail, you're going to go a little bit longer. And you want to be kind of aggressive in the shaking of this one. The other benefit of aggressive shaking, you don't want to do this in all cocktails, but when you do it, you're breaking up the ice. And the result is that you get ice crystals in your finished cocktail. And that changes the texture and the temperature and also the dilution of the finished cocktail. And that's important to us. All right. Now, because all those little seedy bits are still in there, we're going to double strain this cocktail because you don't want the fennel seeds in your finished drink. So you just use a mesh cocktail strainer. And this is, by the way, a cobbler style shaker. And cobbler style shakers, if you can see, have a strainer built into them. But the holes generally are too large to strain out all those little bits and pieces. So we have.
Now, this was the liquid crystal, right?
Yes.
All right.
Now we're going to finish it with a splash of sparkling wine. And by the way, I know that this isn't necessarily the best Prosecco on the market, but I love the little bottles that they're selling these days because they're perfect for cocktails, because a lot of cocktails will have a splash of sparkling wine at the end. And I'm not saying I wouldn't drink the rest of a large bottle of Prosecco, but this does make it easier. So, and that is your liquid crystal. So cheers. Oh, that's really good. I love that. It's lightly fruity, very lightly sweet. I don't like really overtly sweet cocktails. I like them to have a gentle sweetness because sugar kind of blows out a lot of other flavors and you lose the nuances. And in this case, you really want to taste that fennel. You want to taste the floral notes of the honey. You want the kind of the spiciness and the brightness of the ginger. And if you added a ton of sugar, all that would be lost. So anyway, that's delicious. So I hope you made it along at home.
So my first question for you is the order in which you add the ingredients important? Sometimes
no. In this case, yes, because if you had added your liquid ingredients, your rum and your ginger liqueur, and then added your fennel seeds, you wouldn't be able to muddle them very well. They'd float around, they'd kind of splash all over the place, and frankly, it would splash all over the place as you're muddling. And so in those cases, yes. In many cases, it doesn't matter because you're just adding them all to the shaker, you're adding some ice and you're shaking them up. And so in those cases, it doesn't. One other time when it would matter is if you're doing something that's called like a dry shake. And that's when you shake a certain number of ingredients because they need more time to mix than the other ingredients. So for example, I could dry shake this cocktail. And dry shaking means you put the ingredients in that need that extra time, but you don't put the ice in. And because the whole time you're shaking, you are breaking up that ice, you are diluting and chilling the drink. And that's great, but you don't want to do too much of that necessarily. So you could dry shake the ingredients, then open up the shaker, add ice, close it up again, shake it to now chill and dilute it, and then strain it. So it kind of depends on the cocktail, but I would say in many cases, it doesn't, classic recipe recipe writing style calls for ingredients to be listed in the order in which kind of the greatest volume to the least volume. And that's kind of how most recipes are styled. The variation to that is when it does matter, in such as a dry shake.
So is dry shaking a little bit like power infusing? Just like if you were getting speed infusions?
Yeah. It's a very different process, but in this case, in dry shaking, it's really just a matter of giving the ingredients more time when they're difficult to mix. Speed infusions is one of those kind of great, cool techniques that I essentially stole from high-end mixologists. One of the things that sets apart...
We call that borrowing best practices.
Or inspired by.
Yeah.
And so, one of the best things you'll find in these kind of high-end bars is that the mixologists have created their own infusions. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take a base liquor, say rum or vodka or bourbon, and then they will add to it a really potent ingredient, say lemongrass or coffee beans or something like that. And then they'll let it steep for, say, a day, a week, a month, strain out the solids, and now you have a flavored liquor. I had this drink in London that was coffee-infused cognac, and it was unbelievably good. And so the problem with that, I mean, it's great. And it's one of those things that sets apart their cocktails from ours. The problem with that is that most of us aren't going to plan our cocktails a month in advance, or even a week or even a day in advance. And so I discovered that you can do a speed infusion by using your blender. So you take the same ingredients, you take a base liquor, and you take a flavorful component, another ingredient to throw into the blender. You pulse it for about 10 seconds, chop it up, you're not trying to puree it, and then you let it sit for a minute. Then you strain out the solids, throw those away, and you have an infused liquor in about 2 minutes. I have a martini in the book where I use lemongrass and vodka. And it is just an unbelievably good martini because you get those aromatic, lemony, citrusy notes from the lemongrass, and it doesn't overwhelm the vodka, it doesn't overwhelm the dry vermouth, but it kind of completely changes the flavor profile of the cocktail. And it's a real neat technique that anybody who has a blender can use.
Sarah wonders if you can confirm, when you say ginger liqueur, was that the equivalent of Saint Germain?
No, Saint Germain is elderflower liqueur.
Okay.
And that's very different. It's delicious. And Nigella Lawson once got me drunk on it in New York, but it's delicious, but it's a very floral liqueur, and very floral and very sweet. And ginger liqueur it's very spicy, gingery. And there are a couple of brands. Mine is, which one do I have here? I'm going to butcher the French, so I'm not even going to try. But it's available here in New Hampshire, and I've seen a couple other brands out there. There aren't a ton of them, but they're really delicious. And I'll back up a little bit. One of the things that was really important to me when writing this book is in terms of making the cocktails approachable, is to limit the liquors to a very kind of narrow repertoire. Because as I mentioned, it's wonderful when you go to a high-end bar and they have 100 whiskeys, 20 cognacs, and 30 gins to choose from when they're crafting the perfect cocktail. Most of us don't have that. And so it was really important to me to have a limited repertoire of liquors that we build our cocktails from, because it just keeps it frankly more approachable and more realistic for most of us. And so I kind of had two tiers of liquors that I chose. One of kind of the cores that you would expect, the white rums, the tequilas, the whiskeys, the cognacs. And then there was the kind of the second tier, which are many of them liqueurs that I chose because they don't just add, say, sweetness, which liqueurs by nature are very sweet, but they also add a flavor, and they add a distinct flavor, at least the ones I chose. So I chose ginger liqueur because it adds a very distinct flavor profile that you can work into a lot of cocktails in a lot of creative ways. I chose orange liqueur because it works so well with so many other drinks, other liquors. And I chose things like Licor 43, which has vanilla spice notes. And I chose Benedictine because it has, I think, like 27 herbs, spices, botanicals, and stuff. And it adds a great complexity and depth to a cocktail. So I chose each one because it kind of earned its place at the bar and makes a distinct impression on the cocktail. And so that's kind of the thought process that went into the bottles.
It almost sounds like you've created a capsule wardrobe of a liquor shelf.
Pretty much, yes. All in one, this is what you need.
Sarah also wonders, this drink, is there a strong licorice flavor from the fennel? Licorice is a bit polarizing sometimes.
It can be, you're absolutely right. And no, it's not. It's a very gentle anisette flavor that's very, very much in the background. You're getting the ginger, which mitigates it because, again, I chose the ginger because it has a brightness and a kind of a pepperiness to it. And so I chose that because it does mitigate the kind of anisette flavor that you're getting from the fennel seeds. Now, if you were to use, say, absinthe, which has a very strong anisette flavor, and that's what I was talking about earlier, where a lot of mixologists, we use absinthe to rinse the glass and throw down. That's when you're going to get a much stronger black licorice flavor. And I find that can overpower the other flavors in the cocktail, and especially in a cocktail like this, where so many of the flavors at play are on the lighter, brighter side. You have honey, which is floral and light. You have white rum, which is sweet and kind of neutral. You have, sparkling wine, which is, again, sweet and bright. And if all of a sudden you had a punch of black licorice, that would be overwhelming.
A little bit. So when you are making a new cocktail, do you make them often at home? Do you have something to trigger the creation? Or my question is, what comes first? Do you have food that needs a new pairing? Do you have a flavor you're in love with that you really want to celebrate in a drink? Or does it just come in a flash of inspiration and you wake up in the middle of the night and you need to make a new cocktail?
Usually a flash, although not in the middle of the night. No, actually, back when I used to travel, before the pandemic, I would go to these bars and I would have these drinks that just would blow me away. Because, again, one of the things that really sets these folks apart in terms of the drinks they make is their willingness to explore flavors and ingredients that most of us wouldn't consider to be, say, cocktail friendly. I was in Mexico City, and no surprise, I had a cocktail that was made with avocado in it, and which sounds kind of like a smoothie to me, but it was amazing. And I will say it took me about 10, 15 attempts to get that cocktail right at home, but it was really, really phenomenal. And in London, like I say, I had drinks with miso paste and with roasted chestnuts. And it's just, I find these cocktails that I just fall in love with the flavor profiles and the kind of unexpected and yet common ingredients. And I just love to play with that. That's usually the inspiration. Or sometimes I will have a drink that isn't a cocktail, and I'll think, wow, that's amazing. I was in Vietnam in January, and they have a lemon coconut milk drink. It's kind of their version of lemonade, and it's sold on every street corner. And I was there with my photographer, and we were sipping it. It was incredibly refreshing. And we looked at each other and we said, this needs vodka. And so, I brought that idea home and turned that into a cocktail. That's oftentimes how the ideas begin. And yes, I make a cocktail or two or three or four every night. And, you know, it's trial and error, playing around with ideas, playing around with tastes and combinations and different ingredients. I think it's the playing with ingredients that really excites me, because there are so many things that we don't consider, especially in the spice cabinet. You know, cardamom and cumin, sesame seeds, for example. I have a martini that uses tahini, actually, sesame seed paste, and which is delicious. And that's another one of those ingredients or classes of ingredients that most people don't think about. Fat is amazing for cocktails. Now, you're not drinking fatty cocktails, mind you, but there's a technique called fat washing. Now, a lot of fat has flavor. Bacon fat, for example, has a lot of flavor. And you can put that fat, liquid form, into a liquor and infuse it very quickly. And what you do is you then throw that liquor with the fat into the freezer. Well, the fat coagulates, freezes up, you skim it right off, but it leaves the flavors behind, because a lot of the flavor compounds in fat are actually alcohol soluble. And so they dissolve into the alcohol. You get rid of the fat itself, but it's left behind, say, the bacon flavor. And I do the same thing with honey and miso, and I forget what else is in that one. But it's so delicious, and it's a great way to, again, elevate in a very simple way a wonderful cocktail.
Have any of these experiments failed horribly?
Oh God, yes. All the time. But I will say that was one of the best, you know, as you mentioned, I've written cookbooks for food, and, you know, those are always just such a slog. I love writing cocktail books because, you know, if it's a failure, you dump it down the sink and you try it again in 5 minutes. That is wonderful. If you ruin dinner, you have to start all over at the beginning, and, you know, a ton of ingredients. Cocktails are so much more fun. And I have a few cocktails in the book that were, I expected to fail and didn't. I think one of them is called Mistakes Were Made. And it was one of those cases where I started with something that I thought would be great. It was an inspiration from something I had had at a bar, and I had it and it was awful. And so I added something else to it, still awful. Added something else to it, and it was kind of this progression. And then all of a sudden I added something else to it and it was amazing. And it's kind of those unexpected victories. And so I decided to keep it. And I said, all right, we'll call it Mistakes Were Made. And somewhere along the line, it came out okay.
All right. Fred wants to know, which cocktail would be the best drink to make in a big batch for Thanksgiving?
Okay, so I would say the Drunken Orchard, which is, if I remember correctly, it has apple cider, fresh apple cider, and bourbon. It might have orange bitters and a little bit of agave or sweetener to it. And my recipe, you know, every recipe in the book is for a single cocktail, but that is one that's seasonal. It would work with all of your Thanksgiving foods, and it has a nice warm flavor to it, but a gentle sweetness, and it would be perfect. You could mix it in a pitcher very easily and then pour it out. In fact, I used that a few years ago and got my father a little bit drunk on it.
And that was the Drunken Orchard?
Yes.
All right. So we're about halfway through this event right now. I will remind, I think we should mix another drink.
I think we should mix another drink.
And is this next one the one with the egg whites, or?
Nope. We're going to do the cinnamon toast.
All right, because someone asked for help with that because it never comes out the way that they plan for it. But
with the egg whites?
Yes, dry shaking.
Oh, we can do that one next. Let's do that one next.
All right, and I do want to remind our attendees that the book is available. Signed copies are available from Gibson's bookstore. We hope you do your holiday shopping early to avoid printing delays, shipping delays, just to get the stress out of the way. And we have signed copies in the store right now. We are open for browsing, shipping, curbside pickup. We would love to get you a book. Tell us about this drink now.
All right, so this is the apple cream pie. And it does include egg whites, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But you can make it with either vodka or bourbon. But since the other two cocktails that we're making tonight are clear liquors, I decided to go brown, and we're going to do it with bourbon. And I'm a bourbon guy. That's my favorite. And so for this cocktail, we are going to grab our shaker, and we are going to add 2 ounces of bourbon or vodka.
This is a different kind of shaker.
It is. I love these shakers. They're inexpensive, they're wonderful, and they're great for video because you can see exactly what I'm doing. And also, by the way, what I love about it most is actually it screws on and it has a really nice tight seal with a silicone seal and it pops up. So I love these.
One of
I
our questions
own too
actually
many.
was they 100% switched to Boston shakers because the type you were using leaks, drips, makes a mess. Is that, do you have a favorite? Are there different kinds that you like to use for different kind of cocktails?
Yeah, so I actually don't recommend Boston shakers because I find that for the home mixologist, they are difficult to use. Now, a Boston shaker, I have too many shakers here, is generally, there we go, where you take a big and a small cup and you invert them and you shake them. What happens is, though, the cups get stuck and it can be very difficult to release afterward. It's also easy to, when you're shaking, have it explode all over the place. I'm not a big fan of Boston shakers at home because you really have to know what you're doing to handle it. I do like the cobbler style shaker, and this is a Libby, Libby, and I like them because it has a screw top. It has a nice tight seal. It never has leaked on me. And the top part is a really tight fit as well. This one that I used earlier, this is made by Elevated Craft, I think is the name. And it too has a tight seal because it screws on, it's insulated. Even the top cap screws on. They have silicone seals on them. I love these, and this just came out, and so I've only been playing with this for a month or two, and I absolutely love it. That one's a little bit pricier. This one's nice and cheap, but they all work really great. I'm a big fan of this style. So let's see. We have 2 ounces of bourbon in here. We're going to add 1.5 ounces of fresh apple cider. There we go. And then we're going to add 1/2 ounce of Liqueur 43, which I mentioned earlier. It has a really nice kind of vanilla spice to it, and I find it difficult to get those flavors from other liqueurs. Again, that's why it earned its place in my book and in my liquor cabinet. It has a nice gentle sweetness that really works in so many cocktails. All right, we've got our booze in there. We're at 3 ounces. Now we can talk about egg whites. So egg whites, first of all, it's the slime factor. A lot of people are put off by the slime factor. Don't. Egg whites are not slimy in a cocktail. When you mix them in, they are going to get frothy, they're going to get foamy, they're going to give the cocktail a creaminess to it. What's important is to make sure that there's always an acidic ingredient in the cocktail, because the acid helps emulsify the proteins in the egg whites, and that's what gives you your foam, your froth, your creaminess. That's very important. The second part that wigs people out about egg whites is the food safety factor. And they are raw, and we are going to drink them raw. This is why I always use carton egg whites. They're pasteurized, so they're safe to eat raw. The third, however, and this addresses the question at hand, the third point is that carton egg whites, absolutely every time I've made a cocktail, always mix perfectly. Now, I have tried freshly cracked eggs. I hate them. I never use them for cocktails because they don't mix reliably. They curdle, they turn into a mess. You have to get the yolk out. What are you going to do with the yolk? You throw it away, I guess, or you cook a yolk. And they're very difficult to measure because, the egg white is kind of gelatinous. These, it's easy to measure. You just pour what you need. You put it back in the fridge. You're not wasting anything. They mix so much better. I am a huge believer in carton egg whites for cocktails. I know I see it at high-end bars all the time where they crack fresh eggs, and maybe they're getting the eggs like straight from the chickens or something, and maybe that makes a difference. I don't know what they do that works, but I never have success with freshly cracked eggs at home, so I only use carton egg whites. So we're going to use 1/2 ounce. Well, that's a little bit more than 1/2 ounce. We're going to pour some of that out. There we go. All right, 1/2 ounce of egg white. Bartending is not a science. All right, so I think we've got, and the next one, we need 6 to 10 granules of kosher salt. Now, this is an important lesson because when we think about salt in cocktails, we generally think about rimming the glassware for a crappy margarita. And I'm going to tell you that is the absolute worst way to use salt in cocktails. As soon as your mouth, your lips, your tongue hit that salt, your taste buds have been blown away. You're not going to be able to taste anything that's in the glass. None of the nuance that you've been working to create in the glass is going to survive. And that's a shame. However, one of the hallmarks of really great high-end bartending is to use salt in the cocktail. And salt, just like in our cooking, rounds out the flavors, elevates and heightens the flavors of our cocktails. You know, if we didn't salt our food, it tastes flat. Well, it's also true for cocktails. A little bit of salt goes a long way. Now, at high-end bars, they will often use a dropper to put a saline solution into the cocktail before they mix it. I have found that that's not necessary. A couple of granules, I usually say 6 to 10 granules of kosher salt added to the shaker or to the stirring glass is plenty, and they mix up fine, and they give it that kind of an elevated flavor, a rounded flavor. You're not going to taste any salinity. It's not going to be a salty cocktail, but it will brighten the flavors that are already at play. Now I got to put the ice in. All right.
So do you put ice in before you shake an egg cocktail?
Yes. Yeah. For this one, at least, yes. I can imagine that there are others where you would dry shake it first, but in this cocktail, yes. And an egg white based cocktail is another case where you want to give it a good hearty shake because you really want the acid. And by the way, the acid in this cocktail is coming from the apple cider. And the acid to emulsify those proteins in the egg white, you really want to give it that opportunity to get frothy and foamy and creamy. And that's what's going to make it so delicious. There we go. And then we just strain it out. And you can see you already have that kind of creaminess to it. And you're going to get a nice foamy head on it. There we go. And as you can see, you have that nice layer of foam on the top, and that's coming from the egg whites. So cheers.
Is this one that you're going to want to drink fairly quickly? Does it settle? Does it separate?
It holds. No, it holds fine. And again, if you were using, if you were mixing a drink that didn't have a lot of acid in it, you wouldn't get the emulsification of the proteins, and then it wouldn't hold well. But every cocktail that I've ever used or have ever had egg whites in, make sure it includes a high acid ingredient for that reason. You know, the pisco sour, for example, is a classic cocktail from Peru that uses either a lot of lemon juice or a lot of lime juice and egg white to create that kind of frothy, creamy consistency. So you're fine. Once it's mixed, as long as you do a good job mixing, you're fine.
So it's interesting that you keep mentioning acid and salt. And you have a strong cooking background. I was speaking to a chef once, and he said that one of the keys to making restaurant food at home is that when something's missing, you're either lacking in salt or acid, and either of those will open up the flavors. Is that like one of the base techniques of cocktail mixing? You're looking for acid or salt?
I would say it's actually a base technique of flavor. And so I absolutely agree with that. You know, our palate is very sensitive to salt and to acid. And both of them have the same effect on food in the sense that they heighten flavor and they add a sharpness to flavor. And so, or to other ingredients. And so, you know, oftentimes, the chef is absolutely correct, you know, and it's not particular to cocktails, it's particular to all cooking, that you want to add that kind of brightness because, and salt will elevate and round out the other flavors. Acid adds a brightness and it elevates. That's why, for example, a lot of times you will squirt some lemon juice over a dish right before you serve it. And it's certainly why we salt food. And in cocktails, I feel like acid is well known. I mean, you know, acid shows up all the time in cocktails, but salt is, at least at home, is very rare. And people just, again, think about rimming the side of a cocktail glass. And, but again, much like, you know, our cooking, we don't want flat flavors in our cocktails. So just a little bit of salt goes such a long way to bringing that all together and heightening the other flavors. You know, when you think about it this way, you know, ginger, you know, as the ginger liqueur I used earlier, is a lovely flavor. It's bright, it's sharp, it's got a sweetness to it, but now add salt to that and it's even brighter, it's even, you know, it's even sharper, and it kind of is more pronounced in your glass. And so I believe very strongly that salt belongs, not in every cocktail, there are plenty of cocktails that don't need it, but I find that more often than not, when I try a cocktail and it feels a little flat or it feels like it's missing a little something, I actually very frequently will dump it back in the shaker without ice and throw a little bit of salt in it, shake it up, and it's transformed. The other thing that the chef maybe didn't mention, but is bitter. Bitter is another flavor compound that is very important to balancing flavor, and cocktail bitters are very important to mixology. And, you know, I have orange bitters here, but these days you can buy bitters in a million different flavors. And it's wonderful because bitter, again, balances sweet, it balances sour, it adds complexity to savory, and it's a really important component to cocktails and food, frankly. And so you know, that's another one of those things that, you know, my joke in developing this book actually was that every time a cocktail was kind of flat or was kind of lacking in something, oh, it must need salt, or maybe it needs bitters. And more often than not, adding one or both of those did actually round out the flavors of the cocktail and made it like just right. So cocktail bitters are wonderful. The other thing I like about cocktail bitters is that it allows you to add to or change the flavor profile of a cocktail without changing the acidity of the cocktail or the sweetness of the cocktail or even the volume of the cocktail. Because, for example, well, these are orange bitters. If I wanted to add orange flavor to a cocktail and I wanted to use, say, orange juice or even muddle a slice of orange into the cocktail, I am right there. I'm changing the volume, I'm changing the acidity, and I'm changing the sweetness of the finished cocktail. Whereas with orange bitters, I'm doing none of that. I'm adding kind of the essence of orange, which is going to transform the cocktail, but without changing other factors that I may not want to. I mean, there's certainly times when I will want to add the sweetness or the acidity of orange juice, but you don't always want to do that. And for those times, bitters are kind of like the you know, silver bullet for all of it.
So on this topic, cooking is an art and baking is a science. It's kind of chemistry. Which is drink mixing?
Oh, definitely an art, because, you know, there's a million ways you can combine these things. And I don't worry too much about measuring all the time. I don't bake. I hate baking because you have to, you know, you have to measure. You have to actually know what you're doing. And I love cooking because I can just throw stuff together and it comes together and you adjust as you go and you make it work and it's delicious, or it's not, but you get it to the finish line. Cocktails are much the same. You know, there is science, and understanding that science is very helpful. Egg whites, for example, understanding how they emulsify, why it's important to have acid, very helpful to know these things. But, you know, it's so much about flavor development and kind of creative combinations of flavors and balancing those flavors. And there's so many millions of ways to do that, that's kind of the fun. That's the creative process. You know, how do you take tahini and put it in a cocktail and make that work? You know, and because this is a savory ingredient, how do you turn that into something that's refreshing and delicious and wonderful? And that's kind of the creative fun part of it. So I definitely think it's an art.
Okay. Before we pack away the ingredients for this current cocktail, someone wants to know what that cool bourbon bottle was.
Oh, okay. So this has a story. I love this. I discovered them or was introduced to them in Amsterdam. And apparently back in the, I want to say, I don't remember my research on this. I want to say it dates to the 16 or 1700s. And when Genever, kind of a predecessor of gin, was bottled in these and sold in the Netherlands this way. And it's very cool. I mean, I absolutely love this. It's got these weird like channels on the side. And I was at a flea market in Amsterdam and they were selling them and my luggage was already like jammed tight and I knew I couldn't get one home safely. And so I didn't bring it home and I was really bummed. And then about a year or two later, I was in Copenhagen and stumbled into another antique shop and they had dozens of them cheap. And so I literally packed my bag with these that time. And so they traditionally, they are used for, like I said, Genever, the predecessor of gin. And I absolutely love them. I think they're the most beautiful thing in the world. They do have a name that I can't pronounce in Dutch, and but they are wonderful.
So speaking of glassware, how important is the glassware? If like I did the next one, the cinnamon toast, but I didn't have a martini glass.
So yes and no. You know, it's one of those things that, again, there is science behind it, and the science can be helpful. But at the end of the day, I'll drink a cocktail out of a sippy cup if I have to. I mean, it's not a big deal. But so the most basic way to explain this is actually to take a coupe. And the coupe, actually, which we use for a lot of cocktails these days, was originally designed to be for sparkling wine, for champagne. This was the original way to drink champagne, not the flute. The flute, actually, scientifically speaking, is the worst way to drink sparkling wine. The reason for that is you have this narrow channel, and as we know, flavor comes a lot from the aromatics of the food, not just the taste in the mouth. You know, flavor we experience through multiple senses. And sparkling wine has all these aromatics, has all these bubbles that are popping at the surface and releasing their aromatics, releasing their aromas. We need to experience those in order to fully appreciate and fully experience the flavor of the sparkling wine. Well, when you have this narrow little flute where very few bubbles can pop the surface, you're not getting the full experience. When you put sparkling wine into a coupe, now you're getting the full experience. You're getting a much more intense aromatic experience of the sparkling wine. So in those cases, yes, it matters. In many cases, no, it doesn't matter. Could I drink an old fashioned out of a coupe? Of course. A little weird, but who cares? You drink it out of whatever you have. The other time it matters, though, so I would say a wide bowl is important when the aromatics of a cocktail are important. So things with sparkling wine, for example, things with a lot of aromatic ingredients in it, that matters. Old fashions, drink it out of whatever you like. But the other factor is volume. You know, there are times when a drink just has a lot of volume, and that's when you want it to be in, say, a highball or Collins glass, which just gives you a greater volume. But again, if you have a really big rocks glass and you want to serve a cocktail that normally would be in a Collins glass and a rocks glass, go for it. You know, you're not going to diminish the experience at all. But like I say, the time to pay attention is when it's a really aromatic cocktail, because then you definitely want a wide bowl to it so that you experience the cocktail fully. And sometimes it's really just how you're drinking it. If I'm bringing a cocktail out to the fire outside, in the yard, then I want something that's sturdy and that I'm not going to slosh all around. The coupes are kind of clumsy for that. But if you want a more elegant experience, and we shouldn't discount the importance of the experience. Cocktails are about an experience. That's why we go to these bars when we can. And that's why we mix them sometimes, is because we want that experience. We want that kind of craft elevated experience. And so a coupe is wonderful for that. But I mean, the short answer is that oftentimes it means nothing. So
I like that answer. I like that answer a lot. Let's move into, I think we've got time for our third drink. Let's move into.
All right, excellent. All right, I'm going to push this one aside so I stop drinking it. And I'm going to grab our other cocktail shaker. Now, this is called the Cinnamon Toast, and I believe you made this. And what I love about this cocktail is it's very simple. It's like 4 ingredients, and it's one of those cocktails that the end result is so much more than the sum of its parts. It's so much more than the ingredients would suggest, because it literally is gin, a little bit of sugar, some orange bitters, and some cinnamon. And when you combine them, they just become, well, cinnamon toast, really, in flavor. And it's really lovely and wonderful, and it feels so sophisticated and yet warm and cozy. And I love it when a simple cocktail can convey that much. So to do this, we're going to grab our gin. I have some London Dry gin, which, by the way, is really the best gin for mixing. These days, there are a million gins on the market. Some of them are lovely. There's actually one made here in New Hampshire, Carner Blue, that is phenomenal. But generally, for mixing, I prefer just a London Dry, basic London Dry. And so we're going to do 2 ounces No, I take that back. We're gonna do 3 ounces. Told you I like it strong. There we go. A little bit more. That's good. All right. So we have 3 ounces of London Dry. And then we're going to throw in a 1/4 ounce of agave syrup. Now, you could use simple syrup. I use agave because it's easy. I can buy it. It's cheap. It's everywhere. And it's neutral in flavor. And it mixes just as well as simple syrup. There we go. But if you want to make simple syrup, you certainly can. All right, so that's a 1/4 ounce of agave syrup. And we're going to throw in some orange bitters. And by the way, when you buy bitters, they usually come in these bottles with kind of the shaker tops. I hate those because they're really hard to control. I go online and I buy these dropper bottles for, I get a dozen of them for $10 or something, and I transfer my bitters into them. It gives you so much more control over the amount that you add. There we go, some orange bitters. And then we're just gonna add a tiny pinch of cinnamon. Again, finding flavor in your spice cabinet. A little bit more. There we go. There we go. All right. Now, before we mix this is a kind of where timing does matter. Before we mix this, we are going to bash some ice. We need some crushed ice. And on a week like this, it's probably the best therapy you can buy.
I like this. I used a blender, but I wish I'd used a hammer.
Oh, no, 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 no. You want to use an ice mallet and what's called a Lewis bag. It's just a canvas bag that you throw ice in and you bash it up. And so I'm going to add some ice to my Lewis bag. You don't need a ton. I'm going to fold that over and bash it. Really the best therapy. There we go. All right. I'm surprised I haven't smashed my thumb on one of these.
That looks deeply satisfying today.
It is incredibly satisfying. I'm not going to tell you what I was thinking while I was doing it, but it was a lot of fun. So I'm going to add just a little bit. There we go. Usually you fill your glass about halfway with crushed ice. There we go. All right, now we can mix our cocktail. We'll add a little bit of ice to our cocktail shaker. Now, crushed ice is one of those things that changes the texture of your drink. We don't think about the texture of cocktails. We don't think of them as having texture, but they do. And so, for example, the texture of the apple cream pie has kind of a creamy viscosity to it. The texture of the liquid crystal is very clean and smooth and bright. This is going to have a different texture because it has crushed ice in it. And so texture is another one of those things that changes a cocktail and kind of separates it, again, from high end for what we might make at home. It's one of those simple things that we don't have to, we don't often think about, but it's a great way to elevate the cocktails that we make at home, is to think about the texture of the cocktails that you're making. So,
when I was drinking mine, it was a little bit like it was a slushy, but
yes, exactly, which has a very different texture than, say, an old fashioned or something, or a Manhattan.
And then when I got to the end, because yes, I did make the cinnamon toast, and yes, it was amazing. The cinnamon was a little bit gritty on my tongue because I got like my cinnamon had settled. Sally mentions that she mixed a cinnamon toast to sip along as well, and she finds it quite delicious. So.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to join her with a little sip of mine.
Cheers. So talk to me a little bit about substitutions.
Okay, what type?
Can you make substitutions in these drinks? I mean, I didn't have orange bitters. I had grapefruit bitters of all things.
Oh, God, yes. Oh, that would be delicious. And no, I make substitutions all the time. And well, like I say, the apple cream pie, you can make it with vodka or bourbon. You just have to think about the way that flavors play together. And so, for example, the cinnamon toast, I love the way that orange and cinnamon play together. And when they play with the botanicals of the gin, it makes a lovely cocktail. Could you substitute a different flavor profile for the bitters? Absolutely. You could use chocolate bitters, would be amazing. You could use, I think, black walnut bitters are great. Celery bitters would be good. Very different flavor profile, but that would be great as well. And there are so many different directions you could go in with things like that. I make substitutions all the time. And, so for example, the liquid crystal, we use fennel seeds and honey. Obviously, you can use a different sweetener for the honey. You lose the kind of floral notes of the honey, but so be it. But for the fennel seeds, you could use cardamom seeds, whole cardamom pods that you could muddle into the cocktail shaker. I would love to try it with cumin seeds, would be delicious. And I will say, I love cocktails that kind of play on the savory side, because as long as you balance them, and this is, we were talking about this before, acid and salt, as long as you balance savory ingredients with something along the lines of, say, something bright and acidic, something a little bit sweet, you're going to get a delicious cocktail. But I wholeheartedly encourage substitutions and playing with flavors. I mean, that's how you create new things, and that's a whole lot of fun.
So we are coming up on our last 5-10 minutes of this event. So if anybody has some last minute questions that they want to throw at JM, now is the time to do so. The book is available from Gibson's bookstore. He will be scribbling in a couple more. You were just there today, weren't you, scribbling?
I was there today. I was there Monday, I think, and I'm happy to keep going.
It's a wonderful thing to have to come to keep back.
It really is, yes.
So we have a couple questions. I have a question for you. What is the most New Hampshire cocktail you can think of? And Pamela wants to know, what cocktail would you recommend for when their election is finally called?
Oh my goodness. You mean beyond just like a bottle of champagne?
All of it. All of it.
Whatever gives you the greatest amount of comfort. I know what I'm going to drink when it's called, depending on how it's called, of course. But I'm going to drink a Liqueur, which is my favorite go-to drink. And it is a lovely cocktail, very potent cocktail, mind you, that straddles the line between an old-fashioned and a Manhattan. I'm very much a dark liquor guy. And it has it has rye and sweet vermouth and cognac and Benedictine in it, with a few bitters thrown in. Wonderful, soothing, comforting, strong, and just kind of lulls you into the evening. I will be drinking one of those, perhaps plus a bottle of sparkling wine. But
is that in the book?
It is absolutely in the book. Yes, the Liqueur.
And the miso and the tahini ones that you kept mentioning, those are in the book?
Those are in the book as well. Yes.
Fantastic.
And as for the most New Hampshire cocktail, so I will say, now, I've lived in New Hampshire for 20 plus years, and I have specialized in food and drink for most of those 20 years. And I have always been disappointed, and I have been very loud about this, that New Hampshire doesn't have like a cuisine. It doesn't have a state dish. It doesn't have a go-to thing. And that's always driven me nuts. And so I would say the best sort of cocktail for New Hampshire, especially this time of year, is something that uses fresh apple cider and maple syrup. I mean, I will say, there is no reason you couldn't, shouldn't, or wouldn't make the apple cream pie that we had tonight using maple syrup. You know, throw a little bit of maple syrup in there, maybe pull out the Licor 43, because that's adding sweetness. That's its role in that cocktail, is to add the sugar, the sweetness to it, in addition to the apple cider. Pull out the Licor 43, maybe up the bourbon, because, you know, you want a strong cocktail. And up the bourbon, throw in some maple syrup, keep the apple cider, keep the egg white, keep the salt, mix it together. That is going to be a delicious cocktail. Now, the benefit of maple syrup is that it actually does mix more easily than, say, honey. So it's going to mix almost as easily as a simple syrup or an agave syrup. And that will be delicious, because you're going to get kind of those sweet caramel notes that you get with maple syrup. And that is going to play so well with the bourbon and the apple cider. It's going to be a brilliant New Hampshire cocktail. I guess I've just written the New Hampshire cocktail.
I was going to say, you've just founded it. Although I do want to ask you, what is your opinion on like hot cocktails, like mulled wine and cider?
Yeah, not a big fan of that. I almost never do those. It's not that they're not good. Well, okay, I take that back. You know what? I was in London in February, right before the lockdown, and I was at a very high-end bar, and the bartender kept trying to get me to drink his Irish coffee, and he kept trying to get me this, and I said, I don't like coffee-based cocktails all that much. And I certainly don't like warm cocktails. And he said, nope, you got to try this one. We do it best. We do it the best. And then I tried it, and it actually was phenomenal. And there is a version of it in the book based on the one that I had in London, and it really is phenomenal. I call it the Celtic coffee because I didn't just use Irish whiskey. I also added some Scotch to get that kind of smoky peatiness to it, which plays nicely with the coffee. But I really loved it, and that's, however, the only warm cocktail that I've really enjoyed. And to me, a cocktail doesn't have to be cold. It doesn't even have to necessarily be cool, but it definitely, for me, is kind of a room temperature or lower experience. I don't know why that is.
So
I'm sure that there's a psychology behind it.
One gentleman in London.
Yes.
Always cool. All right. Okay. Where'd you get the mallet, by the way?
Oh, well, okay. So you can buy these online, of course. I have a dear friend of mine who lives in Merrimack, who is a woodworker. His name is Scott Blanchard. You can find him online, I'm sure. And he is amazingly gifted woodworker. And I said to him, I would love for you to make me ice mallets. And so he did. And he used salvaged scraps of hardwood and to create these. And I absolutely love it because it's a piece of art, and I absolutely love these. And it's, again, it's therapy as well as art. I mean, how do you find that combination, you know? And so, yeah, I love this.
And arguably one would say that all art is a form of therapy.
This is true. This one particularly so.
So let's see, I guess last question for us, any particular favorite variation on the gin and tonic that you like, and is it in the book, and any tips on that drink in general?
Yes. So my favorite gin and tonic actually is, I believe it's called the cilantro mint gin and tonic. So it's a classic gin and tonic with, you know, nothing unexpected, but you muddle in some fresh cilantro and some fresh mint, which, you know, gin by nature is very botanical. So it's got some spices going on. It's got some roots, you know, going on. It's got some complexity to it. And when you add fresh herbs have the role of heightening flavors, adding freshness, adding brightness to it. And I love that. And I love the way that all of those flavors play together. So that would be my first suggestion. My second suggestion is to limit the amount of ice. One thing I hate is a watered down gin and tonic. Many people add too much ice. And I say that across the board with cocktails. People add too much ice. You know, ice has a role. You want it to chill. You want it to dilute. And there is an important role for the dilution of a cocktail. You know, we think of dilution as a negative thing, but it actually plays a very important role in our experience of a cocktail. The reason is that many of the flavor compounds in alcohol become easier for us to appreciate when they're opened up by a little bit of water. They're water soluble rather than, you know, fat soluble. And so we need a little bit of water to open up the flavors of liquor. And so that's very important. But that said, you add too much and you're blowing all that away. You're going to lose the essence that you're aiming for. So people oversalt their cocktail. I mean, over ice their cocktails way too much. And so I would say limit the amount of ice that you add to your gin and tonic. Add some fresh notes. One option would be some bitters, for example, some orange bitters. That's going to brighten up, play the same role as the fresh herbs. If you're not into fresh herbs in your gin and tonic, add some, say, orange bitters or some peach bitters, something that's going to kind of add a brightness to it. And finally, get the proportions right. You really, I think, too often, too much tonic water is added and not enough gin. You know, I do like my hefty cocktails, but I will say that when you add too much tonic water, you're going to lose all those botanicals that you are adding in the gin, and you really want to be able to appreciate that. So watch your proportions.
This is where we start to move into the chemistry side. It's a little, I'm the baker in the family.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So, I mean, I bought my husband whiskey stones one year for the holidays, and he still ended up putting drops of water into his whiskey. And I was like, what are you doing? I thought you didn't want, he's like, no, chemically you need to open it up with water.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
But if you dilute it, I mean, I'm going to go for like a baking metaphor. Your cake isn't going to rise because it's
right.
Just, you've blown the eggs. So I'm mixing metaphors here, but
no, but it's absolutely true. You again, there's a role for dilution, but you don't want to take it too far because then you're going to lose all the flavors that you're going after in the first place. And so it's very important to get it just right. And I will say that oftentimes when I make an old fashioned, for example, and this is something that I differ very strongly with Christopher Kimball, is that he adds a ton of ice to his old fashioned, and that drives me nuts because you're just kind of ruining the drink. I actually, when I make it, I will only use one ice cube and one small ice cube. And oftentimes I will spoon out the ice cube about halfway through the drink because I don't want it to continue diluting. It's already served its purpose. It's chilled the drink very mildly. It's diluted it just a little bit, just enough to open up all the flavors. And then I don't want it to continue because I would like to take my time sipping it. And so I want to yank it out and get rid of it so that the drink is stabilized at that point. So don't be afraid to take the ice out of your drink because that's a good thing, actually.
I like this. All right. So this has been a really great event, not only because we were sharing cocktails.
Well, that's always a good thing.
I mean, it makes everything so much more fun. Thank you so much for joining us, JM. JM Hirsch, the author of Shake, Strain, Done. Thank you, everybody, for joining us from home. Wish we could have had you in the store, but it's just as well that we don't have to drive home tonight.
This is true.
So thank you so much for joining us. Copies of Shake, Strain, Done are available from Gibson's bookstore. Any last tips for aspiring drink mixers before we leave?
I'm going to go back to the salt. Get your salt. Do not be afraid of salting your cocktails. It is the single most important thing I discovered in writing this book, is that if you add just the tiniest bit of salt, you are never going to taste it, never at all. But if you just add 6 to 10 granules of kosher salt and you mix it up, it's going to be phenomenal. It's going to change your drink and it's going to elevate those flavors, round them up. It's not going to taste flat. And you can do it with any cocktail. You might not necessarily feel that every cocktail needs it, but you certainly can do it to any cocktail and you will notice a difference. So what I love about it is it's one of those ways of elevating your cocktails that anybody can do effortlessly. So I really recommend that.
Excellent tip. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody joining us at home. Have a great night, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.